Getting ready to do this now. Okay. Alright. Let's get this started. 3, 2, 1. Hi, this is Damien Marie AtHope, and I am an axiological atheist, which can simply be understood as a value theory or a value science atheist. And stuff I'm going to talk about today has to do with archaeology and anthropology and prehistory and history and stuff that has to do also with ethnography and understanding of other stuff that has to do with science. And just so people know before I get started, I actually have a bachelor's in psychology and with some also classes in sociology, a little bit in criminology education. So the stuff I'm talking about is actually stuff that I've learned on my own and not in college, just so I can get everyone on the same page of understanding before I start talking. But as I'm an autodidact, I'm someone who's taught myself, and I've been basically studying for about 10 years. So here we go. Religion Evolution by Archaeology and Anthropology. Understanding religion evolution. Pre-Animism, at least 300,000 years ago. Animism in Africa, about 100,000 years ago. Totemism in Europe, about 50,000 years ago. Shamanism in Siberia, about 30,000 years ago. And paganism in Turkey, about 12,000 years ago. And progressed organized religion in Egypt, starting about 5,000 years ago. And all current world religions are sometime after 4,000 years ago. So to me, understanding the evolution of religion, or religion evolution, is to understand that like Legos, they build on top of each other in a sense. The religious ideas from the past then become the ones that are used sometimes the same and sometimes in a different way in the future world religions. So Animism, Totemism, Shamanism, to me these are all not as much as you would consider a religion, as more ways of doing things in a kind of religious mix of culture also. Because it's kind of hard, in a sense, to tell some of the parts, what parts are culture, what parts are religion. Because to me, these are all ideas that were before this really fixed set of cultural ideas happens much later. So let's go through it again. So pre-Animism, like I said, is where it starts. And if you're a religious believer, though, may I remind you that faith in the acquisition of knowledge is not a valid method worth believing in. Because what proof is faith of anything a religion claims by faith? As many people can have different faiths, even in the same supposed religion. And so I'm going to tell you now a list of blogs that I have that you can look up that deal with my evolution of religion, understanding through archaeology and anthropology. So my first blog is, To Find Truth, You First Must Look. And then Archaeology Knowledge Challenge. And then The Evolution of Fire, Sacredizing and or Worship 1.5 million years ago to 300,000 years ago and beyond. Stone Art, 500,000 years ago to 233,000 years old. And then around 500,000 to 233,000 as the oldest, in a sense, anthropomorphic art, which is part of, to me, pre-Animism. And it's also related to female. And so we have also 400,000 years ago is socio-cultural evolution. By the way, these are all blog titles. Pre-Animism, portable rock art at least 300,000 years old. Homo nati, an intentional cemetery which is, to me, evidence of pre-Animism, dating to around 250,000 years ago. Here's another blog. Did Neanderthals teach us primal religion, pre-Animism/Anism, 120,000 years ago? Another blog, Animism, an approximately 100,000-year-old belief system. You got another blog, rock crystal stone tools, 75,000 years ago, from Spain, made by Neanderthals. And another blog, stone snake of South Africa, the first human worship 70,000 years ago. And then another blog, similarities and differences in Animism and Totemism. And then another one, did Neanderthals help inspire Totemism? Because there is art dating to around 65,000 years ago in Spain that have to have been done by Neanderthals. The history, this is another blog, history of drug use with religion or sacred rituals possibly starting 58,000 years ago. Another blog, Totemism, an approximately 50,000-year-old belief system. Another, Australia and Aboriginal religion, at least around 50,000 years old. And then another, modern humans start around 50,000 years ago, helped by feminization. And another, out of Africa, the evolution of religion seems tied to the movement of people. And another, Totemism and shamanism dispersal theory, expressed around 50,000 to 30,000 years ago. And another, possible religion motivations in the first cave art at around 43,000 years ago. And then 40,000 years ago, the lion figure is early totemism from Germany. And then 40,000 to 35,000 years ago, seeing the first use of a totem, possibly ancestor animal, and maybe even pre-goddess worship, as it was a female. And then another blog, prehistoric Egypt, 40,000 years ago to the first dynasty, 5,150 years ago. And then another blog, 38,000-year-old engraving of an onyx, with seeming totemism expression. Another, prehistoric child burials begin around 34,000 years ago. And another, 34,000-year-old lunar calendar cave art found at the time of the shift between totemism and early shamanism. And another blog, early shamanism around 34,000 years ago to 20,000 years ago, Sinclair, Russia, and the Czech Republic. And another, 31,000 to 20,000 years old, the oldest shamanism female buried with the oldest portrait carving, presumably of this female. And another blog, shamanism, an approximately 30,000-year-old belief system. And another, could the phallus phenomenon, a bullhorn, possibly, and the shamanism phenomenon beginning around 30,000 years ago. And another, sky burial theory, and its possible origins at least 12,000 years ago, but likely as much as 30,000 years or older. And another blog, the peopling of the Americas, pre-Paleo-Indians and Paleo-Americans, around 30,000 to 12,000 years ago. And another, could the graviton carving of around 25,000 years ago relate to later goddess and the bull cults, like at Catalhawk in Turkey? And another, similarities in shamanism. And another blog, black white and yellow shamanism. And another blog, shamanistic rock art from Central Aboriginal Siberians and Aboriginal drums in the Americas. And another blog, horned female shamans and pre-Satanism devil horned god worship. And another blog, possible clan leaders and special male ancestor totem poles, starting at least 13,500 years ago. Another blog, Fertile Crescent, 12,500 to 9,500 years ago. Fertility and death cult belief systems. And then another blog, 12,400 to 11,700 years ago. Koriki Tepe in Turkey is pre-early agricultural cult ritualism. And then another blog, Göbekli Tepe, the first human-made temple, around 12,000 years ago. Then another blog, could a 12,000-year-old bull geoglyph at Göbekli Tepe relate to older bull and female art 25,000 years ago and later goddesses and bull cults like that found at Catalhawk in Turkey? Another blog, Cynicism and the creation of goddesses at around 12,000 years ago, as well as male gods sometime after 7,000 years ago. Another blog, First Patriarchy, split of women's status begins around 12,000 years ago, and First Hierarchy, the fall of women's status, is around 5,000 years ago. Another blog, Nufians and the Ancient Peoples at the Origins of Agriculture and Sedentary Life. And another one, blog, JDNA and the Spread of Agriculture, Religion, Paganism. And another blog, Paganism, an approximately 12,000-year-old belief system. Another blog, Shamanism Burial in Israel 12,000 years ago and the Shamanism Phenomena. And another blog, The Need to Mythicize Gods and Goddesses. And another blog, A Historic and Prehistoric Site in Pennsylvania. And another blog, 12,000 to 10,000-year-old shamanistic art in a remote cave in Egypt. And another blog, 12,000 to 7,000 years ago, Paleo-Indian culture in the Americas. And then another, 12,000 to 2,000-year-old indigenous Scandinavians, Nordics. And another one, Norse did not wear helmets with horns. And another, pre-pottery Neolithic skull cult begins around 11,500 to 8,400 years ago. And another blog, Catalhawk, first religious design city, around 9,500 to 7,700 years ago in Turkey. And another blog, 9,000 years to 8,500-year-old horned female shaman of Bad Gum, Germany. And another blog, 8,000-year-old tortoiseshells in Neolithic graves in central China have early writing and seem to be of shamanism. And another blog, Kurgan, 6,000 to 7,000, and dolmens, 7,000 years ago, funerals, ritual, and other. And then another blog, Connected Dolmen Phenomena of the above-ground stone burial structures. And then 6,500 to 5,800 years ago in Israel, the late Paleolithic Copper Age, in the southern Levant seems to express northern Levant migrations, culture, and religious transfer from Turkey and possibly Iran. And then Another blog, stars, ancestors, animal spirits, and deities, going back at least 6,000 years ago. Next blog, the Gravelin, I'm not pronouncing it right, Gasulin, star, a mysterious 6,000-year-old mural from Jordan, a proto-star of Ishtar, star of Iana, or star of Vetus. And then another blog, 5,600-year-old tomb of a mummy, the first bearded male figure in a grave. And the next blog, evolution of science, by at least 5,500 years ago. Another blog, 5,500 years ago, in the birth of state and the rise of hierarchy and the fall of women's status. And another blog, Jorof Culture, 5,100 to 4,200 years ago, and the history of Iran. And another blog, Progressed Organized Religion, starts at approximately 5,000-year-old belief system. And then another blog, The Origin of Logic is Naturalistic Observation, by at least around 5,000 years ago. And another blog, Ziggurats, Multi-Platform Temples, 4,900 years old, to pyramids, multi-platform tombs at 4,700 years old. And another blog, Happy Easter, Happy Ushtar or Esther, at 4,250 years to 3,400 years old. 300 years old is Stonehenge from Russia, called Archaeology. Another blog, when was the beginning time of religions, which seems to start after 4,000 years ago. Another blog, Kotetepe, an archaeological site with a 4,000-year-old women's rights document. And another blog, Single God Religions, Monotheism, to me, equals Monotheism, starting around or after 4,000 years ago. And another blog, Confucianism's Tan, a Shagai God, 4,000 years old, supernaturalism, pantheism, or theism. And another blog, yes, your male god is ridiculous. And then another blog, the prototype of ancient sundials are around 3,900 years to 3,150 years ago, and possibly show a solar connection to later gods. And another blog, the weakening of ancient trade routes and the strengthening of religions at about 3,000 years ago. And another blog, are you aware that there are religions that worship women as gods? Explain how religion tears women down. And another blog, Animism, Totemism, and Paganism, superstitious origins of the God of the Bible and the Bible's religion. And another blog, Jews, Judaism, and the origin of some of its ideas. And another blog, an old branch of religion still giving up fruit, sacred trees. And another blog, dating the Bible, naming names and telling times, written less than 3,000 years ago, possibly to 2,200 years ago. And another blog, did a volcano inspire the Bible God? And another blog, no, dinosaurs and humans didn't exist together just because some think they are in the Bible itself. And another blog, Everyone killed in the Bible flood, Nephilim, giants. And another blog, hey, Damien Goo, I have a question for you regarding the Bible Exodus. And another blog, archaeology disproves the Bible. And another blog, Bible battle, just more Bible babble. And another blog, the Jericho conquest lie. Then another blog, Canaanites and Israelites. And another blog, how accurate account do we have for when Christianity began? And another blog, let's talk about Christianity. And another blog, so the 10 Commandments aren't anything to be seen as good either, right? Of course the answer is no. And another blog, misinformed Christian. And another blog, debunking Jesus. And another blog, Paulism versus Jesus. And another blog, okay, you seem to be confused, let's talk about Buddhism. And another blog, unacknowledged Buddhism. Gods, Savior, demons, rebirth, heavens, hells, and even terrorism. And another blog, His Foolishness, the Dalai Lama. And another blog, Yin and Yang, Sexists with an origin around 2,300 years ago. And another blog, I believe in archaeology, not myths, and why not, as the religious myths already violate reason. And another blog, archaeological, scientific, and philosophic evidence that shows the God myth is man-made nonsense. And another blog, aquatic ape theory hypothesis, as always, just pseudo-science. And another blog, ancient alien conspiracy theorists are pseudo-historians. Another blog, the pseudo-historic and pseudo-scientific claims about the Bankai ruins of South Africa. And another blog, why do people think religion is much more than just superstitionism and supernaturalism? And another blog, religion is an evolved product. And another blog, was the value of ancient women different? And another blog, pre-Columbian Native American site mounds of Cahokia. And another blog, feminist atheists as far back at least as the 1800s. And another blog, promoting religion as real is mentally harmful to a flourishing humanity. And another blog, screw all religions and their toxic lies, they are but fraud. And another blog, forget religion's unfound myths, I have substantiated archaeology facts. And another blog, religion dispersal throughout the world. And another blog, I hate religion just as I hate all pseudoscience. And another blog, exposing Scientology, Eckankar, Wicca, and other nonsense. And another blog, main deity religious belief systems. And another blog, quit trying to invent your God from the scraps of science. And another blog, empiricism denier. And let's go on to the next thing, pre-Anism. Well, pre-Anism, or I think of it as animistic superstitionism, I surmise leads to the later animistic somethingism or animistic supernaturalism as presented in some of the today's, even in today's current religions. and is a representation of what I think is a general idea that started at least 100,000 years ago. But pre-Animism, in an anthropology mindset, is a stage of religious development supposed to have preceded Animism, in which natural objects were believed to contain a spiritual energy. To me, it is a kind of primal pre-religion, or pre-Animism, Proto-Animism, or at least it can be thought that the ideas could rate or transfer to later afterlife. And these ideas may have been transmitted from earlier beings to the Neanderthal, who were also arcane in a sense. Then they spread it to what I think possibly even arcane humans to some extent, or back-forth transfer. When they ended up meeting and even breeding with Neanderthals. Neanderthals also inbred, though, with Homo erectus, the upright walking man, Homo habilis, the tool-using man, and possibly others, which means they could have possibly learned some of these pre-Animism ideas from one of them, like that expressed in some of the anthropomorphic art that could have related to this kind of beginning ancestor veneration. So 300,000 years ago, the first possible appearance of Homo sapiens in Morocco. 270,000 years ago, Y DNA of haplogroup A00, which is considered to be Y chromosomal atom. Of course, we don't believe in God, the Bible, but someone attached that name to that. We have 250,000 years ago is the first appearance of Homo neanderthalis, for sure, with their type of skull. And like I said, this still is interesting because there could be signs from them, over Europe and even Asia, and even in somewhere in the Middle East, which is possibly where we interbred with them. Maybe even picked up some of our shared ideas. So 230,000 years ago to 150,000 years ago, mtDNA of haplogroup L, which is considered mitochondrial Eve, seems to come into existence. And then 195,000 years ago is the Omo remains in Ethiopia, and this emergence of what would be later anatomically modern humans. And then at 160,000 years ago, there's evidence of Homo sapiens. At 100, but by 170, it seems that humans were wearing clothing. And 150,000 years ago, there was the peopling of Africa and the separation of MD haplogroup LO. 125,000 years ago, in a sense, was a peak period of an integral phase. So 120 to 90,000 years ago, the beginning of the Sahara Desert region is actually wet and fertile. So now we get to Animism, around 100,000 years ago. And so Animism in North Africa, I think, could relate to a culture up there that's at least 145 to 20,000 years old. And there's a sub-Saharan African culture that's 130 to 10,000 years ago. So animist is the belief in a spirit-filled life and or afterlife. This is, to me, of course, my ideas. And if you think this way, you're a hidden animist. And animism is approximately 100,000-year-old belief system, with evidence in Quasi Cave, oldest intentional burial of 15 individuals with red ochre, Also, burial in border cave, an intentional burial of an infant with red ochre and a shell ornament. Possibly extending to, or another possibility is, we need to think about, like I said before, did Neanderthals help teach us primal religion of animism? And I think that that possibly could have been up to 120,000 years ago. And they also used red ochre. As well, it seems that Neanderthals may have transmitted some possible or held animistic religion ideas. Or at least burial and thoughts of an afterlife seem to be expressed in their primal type of what can be possibly religious behavior, which could have come for them as early as 250,000 years ago. And Neanderthals certainly were using red ochre from about 230,000 years ago. And there's also Neanderthals have burials with grave goods, but they're minimal, and possibly demonstrating a belief in an afterlife. Think the idea of Neanderthals who may have transmitted primal religion is crazy? Then consider this. It appears that Neanderthals may have built mystery underground circles with stalactites at 175,000 years ago. May suggest with this evidence that Neanderthals were the first actual humans to intentionally bury their dead and to hold services, maybe, or doing some sort of religious behavior. In doing so, and burying their dead, though, in shallow graves among stone tools and animal bones. And exemplary sites of this are Shandar in Iraq. And I'm not good at pronouncing names, by the way. Kebar Cave in Israel, and Krabina in Corsica. Or maybe Neanderthals had it transmitted to them with evidence of the earliest burials actually predating the Neanderthals. 350,000 years old, there's a pink stone axe with 27 Homo habilis in a cave inside of a pit. As well as the fact that the oldest stone art, of course, dates to around 500,000 years old to 300,000 years old. And it could be, that it shows this already seeing the female as possibly magical or having some kind of believed qualities representing something that it was being believed that could have been religion. So 120 to so after really 100, then you have the thing. So and you have to look beyond that. So 80,000 years ago, we see perforated shell beads in Morocco, and they already had evidence of this happening predating humans at about 200,000. So it shows that this is a continued behavior, not an invention by humans themselves, unless it was the humans that started, you could say, at 300 or greater that made those shell beads, but the original ones at 200. But anyways, there's for sure ones at 82,000 in Morocco. And it definitely looks like some of the earliest personal adornment. And at 75,000 years ago, there was a volcano. And I think, like a lot of times, there was events that happened that forced people through climate change, really, to have to leave areas, and because of that, end up, to me, it motivated an increasing variety of religious ideas dependent on the environment and the situations or experiences that they had. So, 70,000 years ago, and also by 75,000 years ago, there was only about 3,000 to 1,000 people on Earth. Because of the climate and stuff, it affected it. And then 70,000 years ago, the earliest example of abstract art from the Babylon's Cave, South Africa, of stone, engraved with hash marks. You also have 70,000 years ago, African origins, in a sense that humans emerged collectively somewhere from sub-Saharan Africa, and then dispersed. And it seems like the evidence is that there was like 3 populations, one in East Africa, one in North Africa, and then one in South Africa. And either they all went to South Africa or the other ones just died off. And Totemism, around 50,000 years ago. Totemism as seen in Europe, 50,000 years ago, mainly in the agrarian culture. Pre-agrarian. In Western Europe, mainly Spain and France, possible translation to cultural diffusion between Neanderthals and, I assume, between humans, by about 50,000 to 40,000 years ago. And then there's a proto-agrarian, which in Europe is found at from 46,000 to 35,000 years ago. Whereas agrarian, classical, early to late is considered generally to be 38 to 26,000 years ago. And in the realm of culture, and archaeological evidence also supports a Neanderthal contribution to Europe's earliest modern human societies, or early societies, I should say, which people would say the Cro-Magnon, which features personal adornments completely unknown before the immigration, and seem to have characteristic association to Neanderthal social archaeological things that are found. So it could be some kind of a link to that. And there's cave art for Neanderthals dated at least 64,800 years ago to more than 66,000 years ago, and are likely Neanderthal cave paintings, as it is thought that modern humans are presumed to be less than 50,000 years ago in Europe, as well as possible cave paintings from Neanderthals dated to 42,000 years ago have been discovered in southern Spain, when it is not thought that modern humans were even there in that area at the time, thus seeming to show that they had started this type of thinking of cave art as well. And most significant recent out of Africa wave took place about 70,000 years ago via so-called the Southern Route, spreading rapidly along the coast of Asia and reaching Australia by around 65 to 50,000 years ago. While Europe was populated by an early offshoot which settled in the Near East and Europe less than 55,000 years ago. All populations before around 40,000 years ago were way more inbred. And then after this time, there was a great decrease, to which I would hypothesize could be a genetic evidence of the possible emergence of incest prohibition, which hints to me at the connection of taboo found in totemism. And in the book Totemism and Taboo, the horror of incest. And this concerns incest taboos that were adopted by societies believing in totemism. Totemism is a belief system scattered worldwide mainly by hunting and gathering peoples, which seems to diminish when agricultural becomes more prominent. Totemism seems to express itself all over North America, especially in the West Coast indigenous peoples, but also in peoples of Peru and in Guyana. It was the African Gold Coast in India and in the South Sea Islands, Australia, Siberia, Egypt, and the Semitic regions, just to name a few. It was thought that the current true totemism is found only among Aboriginals and North and South American indigenous peoples, and in New Guinea, also a few in parts of Africa and India. But it is Australia and America and Africa that are the three main areas where totemism has been found in its most highly developed and widespread forms, just to understand the situation. Although I think it actually probably originated, my belief is in somewhere in northern Spain and southern France, the time of, or shortly after the time of meeting Neanderthals. Anyways, totemism, and I think it might have been a already existing in the coming from Africa, but I think that it was more formalized up in Europe. So totemism, to me, is the belief in spirit-filled life and or afterlife, just like in Animism, as well as attached to and expressed in things or objects. If you think this, then you are a hidden totemist, an approximately 50,000-year-old belief system, though it may be older, as there is evidence of what looks like a stone snake in South Africa, which may have been the first human worship, dating to around 70,000 years ago. Possibly, this could also extend to or from Neanderthals. Likewise, a number of archaeological sites could offer evidence of this Middle Paleolithic society spread, such as that of what the Neanderthals may have also practiced an early form of totemism themselves, and possibly even animal worship, especially of birds, and they seem to like black feathers. In addition to this, could be presumably thought also that their religious practice and their burial of the dead. In particular, based on archaeological evidence in Middle Paleolithic graves that are widespread, show Neanderthal bear-cut cult, in a sense, that could have existed. And animal cults in the following Upper Paleolithic period in general, such as bear cults, may have had their origin in these hypothetical animal cults, like that with the Neanderthal. Animal worship during the Upper Paleolithic intertwines with hunting rites often. For instance, archaeological evidence from art and bear remains reveal that the bear cult approximately had evolved a type of sacrificial bear ceremonialism in which the bear was shot or killed with arrows and then was finished off by a shot in the lungs, a ritualistic buried near a clay bear statue covered with bear fur, with the skull and the body of the bear being buried separately. 100,000 to 50,000 years ago increased the use of red ochre. Several Megalithic Stone Age sites in Africa demonstrate this. Red ochre is thought to have portrayed an element or important role in ritual. 42,000 years ago, ritual burial of a man called in Lake Mungo in Australia. The body was sprinkled with copious amounts of red ochre. 40,000 years ago, Upper Paleolithic begins in Europe. An abundance of fossil evidence included elaborate burials of the dead, Venus figurines, depictions of females, presumably, and cave art also using or involving red ochre, as well as also other things. Agrarian figurines have been found depicting funeral representations of time associated with now extinct mammals, including mammoths, rhinoceros, along with anthropomorphized depictions that may be interpreted as some of the earliest evidences of religion. And many of these 35,000-year-old animal figure were discovered in a cave in Germany. And there was also one with a lion and a horse. Among 6 tiny mammoth and ivory horse figures were found previously. They also found a scapula that was skillfully done in a piece, and it was found the items like that throughout the Upper Paleolithic. The production of ivory beads for body ornamentation was also important during the agrarian period. There is notable evidence of painted caves, however, which appears to have begun with the sojourn, or at least more so. Venus figurines are thought to represent also fertility. And the cave paintings, such as the ones in France, are believed to represent religious thought. The oldest cave painting found at a cave in Spain, an early agrarian, and is dated around 40,000 years ago. In the time in which it's believed that Homo sapiens had actually migrated to Europe from Africa and had spread to close to that area. The paintings are mainly of deer, and the next oldest cave paintings are found in Chaillot, a cave in France, dating to about 37,000 to 33,000 years ago. And the second amount is from 31,000 to 28,000 years ago, but these are mostly done in black drawings. Most of the black drawings are from the early period. And Chaillot Cave appears to have been used by humans during these 2 distinct periods of agrarian and the Graviton. And most of the artwork dates to the earlier agrarian, which is 32,000 to 30,000 years ago. The later agrarian occupation, which occurred 25 to 27,000 years ago. The paintings feature a large variety of wild animals, such as lions and bears. It is strange to think that these animals were roaming around France at that time, but they were. So we have to understand that there has been many climate changes. And there are no examples of complete human figures found in these cave paintings, though. So it seems they were not yet really focusing that much on humans. So 7,000 to 40,000 years ago, Neanderthal shows an admixture of DNA with Eurasians. 50,000 years ago is the earliest sewing needles. And they probably were made by and used by Desovians. And 50,000 to 30,000 years ago, in the mountaineering in North Africa, it's a type of, I'm pronouncing it wrong, moustering, and I don't know how to pronounce it. Anyways, and also the Sahara, like I said, desert region, 50,000, 30,000 is wet and full of fertile for wildlife. And the later Stone Age in Africa begins at this time. And then from 45,000 to 43,000 years ago is the European early modern humans, in a sense, emerge. And from 45,000 to 40,000, you have what's probably a Neanderthal culture in France that looks like Totemism, or has some elements of it. 42,000 years ago, there's Paleolithic flutes found in Germany. 42,000 years ago is the earliest evidence of advanced deep sea fishing technology, and it's found at a cave site in East Timor, demonstrating high levels of maritime skills, obviously, and by implication, this technology needed to make such ocean crossings like reaching of Australia and other islands, as well as they were catching and consuming large numbers of deep sea fish such as tuna. 41,000 years ago, the Soviet hominids lived in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. 40,000 years ago, the agrarian culture begins in Europe. 40,000 years ago, the oldest known figurative art of a zoomorphic lion figure. And 40,000 to 30,000 years ago is a human settlement and aboriginals in Sydney, Perth, and Melbourne. 40,000 to 20,000 years ago is the oldest ritual ceremony of Lake Mungo Lady in Lake Mungo, Australia. 35,000 years ago is one of the oldest figuring art of a human figure opposed to a zoomorphic figure. And now we get to shamanism, around 30,000 years ago. Shamanism is around 30,000 years ago, and I think it's from the Siberia, and it basically connects to the Graviton culture of 30,000 years ago. Graviton culture is 34 to 24,000 years ago. Western Graviton, mainly France, Spain, and Britain, as well as Eastern Graviton in Central Europe and Russia and Siberia. And Eastern Gravitons also include the Plavonian culture, which I think the Plavonian culture also is big into shamanism, or even more so than the Gravitons themselves. Plavonian culture, 31,000 to 25,000 years ago, such as in Austria and Poland. Shamanism, to me, is a belief in spirit-filled life or afterlife, just like in animism. It can be attached to or expressed in things or objects, and these things and objects can be used by special persons. So the things and objects would be like totemism, and by a special person is shaman. So, special person in special rituals to connect to spirit-filled life or afterlife or other beings. And if you believe this, you are a hidden shamanist. An approximately 30,000-year-old belief system. There is what is believed to be a female shaman burial, which is with a matching carved ivory female head belonging to the Plavonian culture. 29,000 to 25,000 is a variant, in a sense, the culture is a variant of the Graviton culture. And so there's also this Graviton culture dated from 29 to 25, in the Czech Republic. And a carved ivory figure in the shape of a female head was discovered near the huts on the left side of this has to do with the first possible shaman. The left side of the figure's face was distorted in the image. It was believed to be a depiction of an elder female's burial, about 40 years old. She was ritualistically placed beneath a pair of mammoth scapula, one leaning against the other. Surprisingly, the left side of the skull was disfigured in the same manner as the before-mentioned carved ivory figure found close by, indicating possibly that the figure was an intentional depiction of this specific individual. The bones and the earth surrounding the body contained traces of red ochre. A flint spearhead had been placed near the skull, and the other hand held the body of a fox. This evidence seems to suggest that this was a burial site of a shaman. And so to me, it seems like most, if not all, of the early shamans were female or feminine in their nature. This is the oldest site known for, in a sense, also ceramic figurines and artistic portrayals. Evidence could be also of female shamans. Women were much more prominent in religion in general before 5,500 years ago. Archaeologists usually describe two regional variants of the gravitans: the Western gravitans and the Eastern gravitans. And these were known in a sense as specialized mammoth hunters, and whose remains are usually found not in caves but in open-air sites. And I think this also could reflect the switch to what I think later is sky burials. The origin of the Grabian people is not clear. They seem to have appeared simultaneously all over Europe. Though they carried distinct genetic signatures, the Gravitans and agrarians before them were descended from the same ancient founding population. According to genetic data, 37,000 years ago, all Europeans can be traced back to a single founding population that made it through the last ice age. Furthermore, the so-called founding fathers, as they were, are part of the agrarian culture, which was displaced by another group of humans later called the Gravitan culture. And this dispersal and transportation basically happened from 37,000 years ago until 14,000 years ago, when different groups of Europeans, in a sense, who had descended from a single founding population spread out. To a greater extent than the agrarian predecessors, the Gravitans are known for their Venus figures. So they took a thing that the other population was semi-doing and really started amping it up. And then there's the Magdalene. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Not good at names. Who were around or dating from about 17,000 to 12,000 years ago, who were another large cultural group that seemed to express a kind of shamanistic totemism and ranged from southeast France to the western shores of the Volga River in Russia, with a large number of sites also in Italy. Later phases of this culture were also synonymous with the human resettlement of northwestern Europe after the last glacial maximum and during the late glacial maximum. Research in Switzerland, southern Germany, and Belgium have provided radiocarbon data that supports this. The Magdalens made elaborate worked bone, antler, and ivory, and both function for aesthetic and cultural as well as ritual religious purposes, including perforated what are called batons, examples of Magdalene portable art, and this includes the batons with writing on them, or like not writing on them, like art on them. And then figurines and also engraved projectile points, as well as items of personal adornment, including seashells and perforated carnivore teeth, and it's presumably bracelets, necklace, something. And fossils sourced are precisely of an origin that support that the Magdalene hunter-gatherers had seasonal ranges, and perhaps even had complex trade routes, or maybe small, less complex, but still had trade routes. Cave sites, such as the famous Luxor cave, contain some of the best known examples of this kind of cave art. The site in Altamira in Spain with extensive various forms of the portable mortuary art has been able to provide a suggestion of ornamentation at this site. And many shell groups were used by these hunter-gatherers. And research has put forward that religious beliefs that are seen as a basis of the origin of this Paleolithic art. And other art from France contains important type of Magdalene paintings and engravings, and they seem to all express religious significance. These expressions of our seemingly shamanistic, totemistic art involve such things as animals, together with a couple of, in a sense, half human figures, half animal figures that are located on walls and deep interiors. What is known at or labeled as sanctuaries, often filled with 280 overlapping engravings, figures of things like bison, horses, stags, reindeer, ibex, mammoths, some of them dating to around 14,000 years ago. The so-called sanctuary is dominated by the cave's most famous type of figure, and both painted and engraved, known as the horned god, or the sorcerer, which looks like somebody possibly wearing a reindeer antlers, which I surmise is just a shaman trying to embody an animal spirit. To me, by the horns themselves connected to possibly star ancestors in the heavens above, or star-horned animals relate to such things. Such as how I think, in a sense, stars hold the belief for them that they are part of these sky beings, such as like fallen stars. As ants, these are part of them in the sense where people get the idea that stars are ancestors, or stars are animal spirits, or deities, and that happens by at least 6,000 years ago or older. But anyways, horned shaman. Also, there's horned female shaman generally. And it seems to me that possibly could connect to the Satanism ideas of these devil horned, god worship, horned females. Well, it seems that at least the horned female is at least 10,000 years or older, or horned shamans. What, in a conclusion, is there from this, in a sense, shaman, holding a horn headdress, in a sense, or having horn headdresses? It would seem to me also connect to the future idea of horn gods in general, or horn sorcerers, shamans. And depictions of what looks like a human figure with several different animals, in a sense, a mass of animal figures from 13 feet high above the cave can be interpreted as some kind of a great spirit or master of animals. The unusual nature of the so-called sanctuary's decoration may reflect a practice or belief in magical expression of shamanistic or totemistic ceremonies. In a different part of the cave, there is a small chamber known as the Chapel of the Lioness. It contains a large engraving of a lioness on a natural, looks like altar, and numerous special objects, animal teeth, shells, flint tool, carefully placed below and around the walls. These are presumably some sort of like offering objects. So, but 33,000 years ago is, in a sense, the oldest domestication of dog skulls. And they existed in Europe and Siberia, but possibly Siberia is the origin of their domestication. 31,000 to 16,000 years ago is the last glacial period, and it peaked at 26,500 years ago. 30,000 years ago, rock painting tradition begins in rock shelters in India, but presented as a collection in a sense of what could be religious rock art. And there is about 800 rock shelters, of which in India, in a sense, 500 contain paintings. So 29,000 years ago, the earliest, in a sense, ovens have been found. 28,000 years ago in New Guinea, a population consists of Asian or Australian. 28,000 years ago, the oldest twisted rope has been found. 28,000 to 24,000 years ago, some of the oldest known pottery used to make figurines rather than cooking or storage vessels. 28,000 to 20,000 years ago, the Gravitan period in Europe is in full swing. The use of harpoons and saws seem to have been invented. 26,000 years ago, people around the world used fibers to make, in a sense, baby carriers or cloth clothing or bags, baskets, nets. 25,000 years ago, a helmet, in a sense, a hamlet consisting of huts built into rocks and mammoth bones are found in the Czech Republic. This is some of the oldest human permanent settlement and has yet been found by archaeologists. 21,000 years ago, artifacts suggest early human activity can be found in one of the cities, capital city of Australia. 20,000 years ago, the Kurgan culture in the Levant. And 20,000 years ago, the oldest pottery with storage vessels, cooking stuff, vessels, whatever, from China. 20,000 to 10,000 years ago, an expansion to Central Africa. And then you have 16,000 to 14,000 years ago, we have Proto-Mongoloid type is found in Japan. And then 16,000 to 13,000 years ago, the first colonization of North America. 16,000 to 11,000 years ago, Caucasian hunter-gatherers, the Caucasoidal type, expand to Europe. 16,000 years ago is a sculpted deep in clay, and is found, in a sense, on the border of Spain and France in the Pyrenees. There's 15,000 to 14,000 years, 14,700 years ago is the earliest supposed date for the domestication of a pig. 14,800 years ago is, in a sense, a humid period begins in North Africa. The region that would later become the Sahara becomes wet and very fertile, and the aquifers become full. 14,500 years ago to 11,500 years ago, Red Deer Cave people in China, possibly some late survival also of arcane or some kind of a hybrid modern human DNA is found. 14,000 to 12,000 years ago, oldest evidence of prehistoric warfare. It's a massacre. And then there's 13,000 to 10,000 years ago is the late glacial maximum. The end of the last glacial period, the climate warms. Glaciers recede. 13,000 years ago, a major water outbreak occurs on Lake Asgaza, which at the time could have been the size of the current Black Sea and the largest lake on Earth. Much of the lake has been drained to the Atlantic Ocean through a river. So 13,000 to 11,000 years ago, earliest dates suggested for the domestication of sheep. Approximately 13,000 years ago, the Younger Dryas Age. Paganism, around 12,000 years ago. Paganism, such as that seen beginning in Turkey about 12,000 years ago. And so a lot of people believe they know about paganism, but paganism to me is in its general form. Let's just explain it how I see it. So paganism, in a sense, is the belief in a spirit-filled life and or afterlife, and it can, which is, in a sense, that's part of the animism, can be attached or expressed to things or objects, totemism. And these objects can be used by special persons and special rituals to connect to a spiritual afterlife, shamanism, or, this is where it changes, or are guided or supported by gods and goddesses. If you think this, then you're a hidden paganist. And so it's approximately a 12,000-year-old belief system. And some of the evidence for this is at Göbekli Tepe, the first human-made temple, as well as later Catalhoq, the first religious designed city, and are both seen to be, to me, evidence of some kind of early paganism. Now, when you understand paganism, to me, it doesn't mean that, just like before, because you invent a new start of ideas doesn't mean that you just wiped away all the old ones. No, oftentimes you keep some of the old ideas, you just rework them. So I think that early paganism is connected to Proto-Indo-European language and religion as well. And the Proto-Indo-European religion can be reconstructed with some confidence, what they're, in a sense, gods, goddesses, myths, festivals, and the form of their rituals or incantations, prayers, songs. And they make up, in a sense, part of their spoken element and some of the archaeological elements found. And much of this activity is connected to, in a sense, nature or natural and agricultural year events. And I think that also paganism has a lot to do with the spread of agriculture in general. Or at least the earliest elements that can be reconstructed seem to be a connection to nature. It doesn't seem to change that much, except for the fact that because of the farmers, there seems to be, as well as a sedentary life, a new desire for there to be things like rain, deities or whatever, or agricultural deities that relate to the, like wheat goddesses or something. Because there's, in Catalhoq, we have like evidence looks like goddess and the bull worship, and to me that the goddesses are like the plants or like the nature itself, and then the bull has to do with, I think, is the storm god, like the Taurus bull, Taurus mountains in southern Turkey. So the bull, though, like I said, to me is the, in a sense, the god. Eventually, it becomes a male itself, and so such as how a deity's gender may not be fixed. Also, is something we need to understand. We present day cultures really fix the characteristics of gender. That was not really such an issue for people in the past. And also to me, because of that kind of a fluid nature of things, the fact that something can be both, say, a storm and a god and an animal and an item, and that doesn't make any confusion, would probably be easy to explain as how Christians try to say they have a supposed, 3-part God that's only a one being. So, I'm not saying I agree with either of these. I'm just saying I can understand what these ideas are trying to represent. And understanding too that something like the goddesses can be restricted, lead to different types. Anyways, there's about at least 28 myths that can be reconstructed in a sense from Proto-Indo-European religion ideas. And many of these myths have since been, in a sense, confirmed with additional research, including in some areas where it can be not accessible to earlier writers. Later writers can understand stuff, such like with understanding Hittite tablets and stuff. And one of the most widely recognized myths of Indo-European was the myth of the Yama is killed by his brother. Anyways, I'm not going to go on to the myth, but some forms of the myth in various Indo-European languages are given, in their creation myths of the Indo-Europeans. And so Proto-Indo-European is estimated to have been spoken by what's believed the original starting language at least by 6,500 years ago. This also seems to connect to the Kurgan hypothesis relating to the constructions of Kurgan grave mounds, which I think are synonymous or early ideas for pyramids. The earliest Kurgans date to from 7,000 to 6,000 years ago, and they're seen in places like the Cossacks, and they're associated with Indo-Europeans. Kurgans were built in a sense, the Epipaleolithic, the Bronze Age, Iron Age, and Antiquity, Middle Ages, and ancient traditions still, in a sense, are active in some way in southern Siberia and Central Asia. Kurgan cultures are divided archaeologically into different subcultures, such as the timber grave culture, the pit grave, Scythian, Samaritan, Humanist, and Kurgan Kipak, if I'm pronouncing that right. Kurgan barrows were characterized by Bronze Age peoples in a large way, and have been found from the Altai Mountains which is in Siberia, to the Cossacks, Ukraine, Romania, and Bulgaria. Kurgans were used in Ukrainian and Russian steppes. Their use spreading with the migration to the East, Central, and Northern Europe around 5,000 years ago. Burial mounds were burial mounds with, in a sense, early complex structures within, in a sense, internal little house chambers. Within the burial chamber, in a sense, the heart of the Kurgan was placed an elite individual, buried there with grave goods and sacrificial offerings. Sometimes included in this were horses and chariots. The structures of the earlier Neolithic period, from about the 4th to the 3rd millennium, and the Bronze Age until the 1st millennium, display a continuity of, in a sense, forming methods. And they were inspired, in a sense, by this common ritual mythological set of ideas. And the Athenolan hypothesis suggests that speakers of these pre-Proto-Indo-Europeans or Proto-Indo-Europeans lived, in a sense, in Athnola first, during the Neolithic era, and is associated with distribution of historical Indo-European languages and expansions, possibly starting around 9,000 years ago, with a proposed homeland of Proto-Indo-European proper in the Balkans around 7,000 years ago, which is thought to be identified with Old Indo-European culture. This hypothesis states that Indo-European languages began spread peaceably, in a sense, by, in a sense, diffusion into European from Asia Minor or Turkey. The Neolithic advance of farming, waves of advance, in a sense. Accordingly, these new inhabitants from the Neolithic into Europe would have spoken Indo-European languages, and later migrations would have replaced them with the Indo-European variants with other, in a sense, Indo-European variants. The expansion of agriculture from the, in a sense, Middle East would have diffused these three language families: Indo-European and Disvadian, I'm not good at reading this, Pakistani and Indian, and Afro-Asiatic towards Arabia and North Africa. Reconstructions of the Bronze Age Pi societies based on vocabulary items like the wheel do not necessarily hold strongly for the Antnola branch, which appears to have separated at an early stage prior to the invention of wheeled vehicles. The Proto-Indo-European religion seemingly stretches at least as far back as 6,000 years ago, and likely could put more further back, I believe, possibly even 12,000 years old. So 12,000 years ago, Jericho has evidence of settlement, and Jericho has a population of camping peoples, probably Nubian hunter-gatherer groups, who left a scattering, in a sense, of tools behind. 12,000 years ago, its earliest dates suggest domestication of the goat. 11,600 years ago, start of current Holocene epoch. And 11,000, in a sense, to 12, could be 13,000 years ago. Earliest recorded date for construction, in a sense, structures at Göbekli Tepe, which also, has possibly some of the oldest surviving proto-religious site, art, in a sense, for sure, that's religious connected on Earth. 11,000 years ago, the emergence of Jericho as a city proper, which is now one of the oldest continually inhabited cities in the sense of the world, and had giant, in a sense, short-faced bears and giant ground sloths, in a sense, at this time also go extinct. And so 10,000 to 10,500 years ago, the earliest supposed date for the domestication of cattle. 10,000 years ago, in a sense, is an extinction event, in a sense, that goes on to the mid-Pleistocene, and in a sense, many of the Ice Age megafauna go extinct, including woolly rhinoceros and Irish elk, cave bear, cave lion, and the saber-toothed cats. Mammoth goes extinct in Eurasia and North America, but it's preserved in small populations other places until much later. Anyway, so 11,000 to 9,000 years ago, and Babylos appears to have been settled during the pre-pottery Neolithic B. And there's Neolithic remains for some buildings that can be preserved at the site. 10,800 years ago is post-glacial sea areas rise, and showing the submersion of land masses, and since it has taken place, or starts to take place. 10,900 years ago in North Mesopotamia, was now Iraq, cultivation of barley and wheat begins. At first, they are used in a sense for beer, probably, or gruel or soup, eventually for bread. In early agriculture, at this time, the planting, in a sense, stick was used, but it was replaced by a primitive plow in subsequent cultures. Around this time, also, is time that there was at Jericho a building of a stone tower. In the sense, it probably had a more religious function since there wasn't that many people. But it could have had other uses. Once again, even if it had a religious use, doesn't mean it didn't have use for anything else. But it also, if it was used, say, as a tower, could have also been used for religious ceremony, because it appears to be somewhat connected to that. Anyways, 9,500 years ago to 5,900 years ago is a Neolithic area, in a sense, for North Africa. The Sahara Desert region seems to support savanna-like environment, with Lake Chad, in a sense, larger than the current Caspian Sea. And African culture develops across the current Sahel region. And 9,500 years ago, Cattle Hawk, in a sense, urban settlement is founded in Turkey or Anatolia. Earliest supposed date for domestication of cat also seems to be about this time. 9,200 years ago, first human settlement are found at several sites and built over an area, in a sense, connecting cities. 9,000 years ago, the Jarahu culture begins in China. 9,000 years ago, the large, in a sense, first fish fermentation seems to appear in southern Sweden. 8,200 to 8,000 years ago, considered to be the 8.2 kilometer event, or I should say 8,000-year-old event, whatever. A sudden decrease in global temperatures likely caused final collapse of the ice sheets that leads to, in a sense, drier conditions in East Africa and Mesopotamia at about 8,000 to 5,000 years ago. Also, there was the development at this time of proto-writing in China. Southeast Europe, there is the Dinsia symbols, and in West Asia, the proto-illiterate cuneiform seems to form. 8,000 years ago, evidence of habitation in Aleppo, although excavations at Tel Carmel, 25 kilometers to north of the city area, was inhabited about 13,000 years ago. Carbon dating at Tel Ramad on the outskirts of Damascus suggests the sites may have been occupied at the second half of the 7th millennium, possibly around 8,300 years ago. However, evidence of the settlement in the wider basin, it goes back to 11,000 years ago, possibly. Anyway, 7,500 years ago, copper smelting seems to be evidence. 7,200 to 6,000 years ago, in a sense, is the phase on Malta. First farming settlements on the island. 6,100 to 5,800 years ago is another phase in Malta. And then 6,000 years ago around is a building in Ukraine, settlement which reached 15,000 to 18,000 inhabitants. 65,000 years ago, the oldest known evidence for gold hoard deposited in Bulgaria. 6,000 years ago, civilization develops more further in Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent region, around the location of now present-day Iraq. Some of the earliest supposed dates for the domestication of the horse and for the domestication of the chicken, as well as the invention of the pottery wheel, also happens about this time. 5,900 years ago is considered another weather event, a rapid increase of aeration event, which likely started in the current Sahara Desert dry phase, which likely started the current Sahara Desert dry phase, and a population increase in the thus Nile Valley due to migration from the nearby regions. It is also believed that this event contributed to the end of the Yuban period in Mesopotamia. 5,800 years ago, in a sense, there's different, in a sense, levels of construction. And then you have in Ukraine, 5,800 years ago, a settlement which reached 15,600 to 21,000 inhabitants. 5,800 years ago to 5,600 years ago, a phase in Malta's prehistory is characterized by pottery consisting mainly of curved lines. 5,700 years ago starts a mass graves at Tel Barak in Syria. 5,700 years ago, you have a settlement in Ukraine that reaches 12,000 to 46,000 inhabitants. And they built 3-story buildings. 5,700 years ago, Minoan culture begins on Crete, or what's thought of as the Minoan culture. 5,600 to 5,200 years ago is another stage in Malta characterized by a change in the way the prehistoric inhabitants of Malta lived. 5,500 years ago, the Uric period in Sumer. The first evidence of mummification seems to be evident in Egypt. 5,500 years ago is the oldest, in a sense, depiction of the wheel. And possibly this connects to the feudal beaker culture. I'm probably saying that wrong. 5,300 years ago, Bronze Age begins in the Near East. New engravings, in a sense, are built in Ireland. And there's a new phase in the Indus Valley civilization begins in the Indian subcontinent at this time. All right, now let's move on to progressed organized religions, which to me starts around 5,000 years ago. So this connects to the prehistoric, in a sense, to the first dynasty, which I think is what this relates to, the first dynasty in Egypt, to where kind of a state, authorized religion really comes into power. There has been some small city-states in Mesopotamia, but this was like a whole country under one type of religion. I think that's where they saw the power of religion mixing with political. So 4,600 years ago, writing seems to be evident in Sumer and Egypt, triggering the beginning of what's called recorded history. And so this is a time, though, of astonishing creativity, with city-states and empires emerged into the vast areas stretching from, in a sense, the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley and to China. The previous millennium had seen the emergence and advancement of urbanization civilizations, new bronze metallurgy, and all kinds of productivity in agriculture. Highly developed new ways of communication came from writing, and the more easily transfer of hard ideas. Around the time of 5,000 to 4,000 years ago, saw the growth of increased riches, in a sense, but for a few people, not the whole. Intellectually and physically, there was a large change. Became a source of condition for the political stage, as rulers sought, in a sense, to gain more and more wealth and power. Civilizations of Sumer in Mesopotamia became a connection, in a sense, of volatile city-states, which warfare was common. And, in a sense, uninterrupted conflicts, drained all available resources and emergence populations in these areas. It's also why I think that Egypt and the pharaohs began to posture themselves, in a sense, at this time from 5,000 to 400 as living gods, made in a sense an essential, differentiate between all other human beings, or tried to make the differentiation. Even in Europe, in the sense at this time, was still largely, somewhat Neolithic cultures, during the same kind of periods. We're still building megaliths, and we're constructing, all kind of giant monuments of their own. So it wasn't just happening in the Near East or Middle East, but all over. And in a sense, it's this new type of more militaristic, I think, religious connection after 5,000 with state-run religion that helps develop and advance it into the ways that we somewhat familiar with in a larger amount today. And to me, I think that it's this also strength of the wars and the ability to war that helped spread the religion of your personal choosing to the benefit of that, in a sense, unification of culture. And this happened really be under dynasties. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the Kurgan, in a sense, hypothesis just a little bit, also known as the Kurgan Theory, a Kurgan model. And like I said, it had to do with the Pi people before. And to me, this is important because I think that they transmitted a lot of the ideas. But let's just state it here. So it's at 5,750, in a sense, Proto-Semitic peoples emerged from a generally accepted, area of the Levant. And the Proto-Semitic peoples migrated throughout the Near East and Mesopotamia, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. 5,700 years ago, in a sense, the Indus Valley trade happens, or is evident at the port cities, at a port city in India. And 5,650 years ago, the Minoan culture, in a sense, happens. So you also have 5,000-year-old birth, in the sense of the state, the rise of hierarchy, and the fall, in a sense, of women's status. Especially because Pharaoh postulated that it had, in a sense, be a male to be a pharaoh, to follow the bloodline through the males. So I think that also the understanding the Indus civilization, I think, might have had some connections to Mesopotamia. And 5,200 years ago, we have cultures emerging in Greece. 5,100, in a sense, is the beginning of a new age among followers, in the sense, for the Indian religions. And the 5,100 also is a time of the forming of Stonehenge was, in a sense, completed. The circular bank and the ditch enclosure, about 360 feet across, may have been completed, though, with a timber circle, not the stone of later Stonehenge. So 5,100 years ago, in a sense, Newgrange, there's a 250,000 ton passage tomb, in a sense, aligned to the winter solstice in Ireland. 5,000 years ago is a unification, about that time, of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. 5,000 years ago is first evidence of gold being used in the Middle East. 5,000 years ago, they found vessels in Denmark. 5,000 years ago, Sumerian Cuneiform emerges from the Proto-Illiterate Yurt period. And it also contains some of the later beliefs. 5,000 years ago, the second phase, in the sense of Stonehenge, is completed. And the appearance of, in a sense, a enclosed cremation ceremony in the British Isles. And then 4,900 years ago is the beginning of the, in a sense, early dynastic period in Sumer. 4,900 years ago, Sumerian pictoglyphs evolved into photograms. I think I'm saying that right. 4,900 years ago, Mesopotamian wars happened in the early Dynastic period. 4,900 years ago, Volv statues from the square temple of modern Iraq were made. 4,900 years ago, Syria found formation of the city of Mari. 4,900 years ago, Semitic tribes occupy Assyria in northern parts, in a sense. 4,900 years ago, Phoenicians settled on Syria's coast, with centers on Trey and Sibin. 4,900 years ago is the beginning of the period of the stage kings in China, also known as the 3 sovereign and 5 emperors. 4,900 years ago, the ziggurats, multi-form platforms, in a sense, start being built. Pyramids, of course, are platform tombs about 4,700 years old. 4,800 years ago, 4,879 years ago, I should say, the rise of the Van Lang Kingdom and the Hong Bang Dynasty in northern Vietnam. 4,874 years ago, the 365-day calendar, in a sense, is in use in ancient Egypt. 4,852 years ago, the beginning of the period, in a sense, for China, emperors. 4,832 years ago is the estimated time of germination of the Methuselah tree, one of the oldest living tree organisms. And 4,807 years ago, suggested date for an asteroid or comet impact occurring in Africa or Antarctica. Around the time of a solar eclipse on the date May 10th, based on analysis of flood stories. Possibly, in a sense, also connected to the Burnley crater. I think I'm reading that right. 48,000 years ago, Europe becomes one of the richest cities in Sumer. 4,800 years ago, there's evidence of harp players from Knossos. In 4,800 years ago in Iran, the creation of the kingdom of Elam. And then 4,775 years ago, the Second Dynasty Wars, in a sense, in ancient Egypt. And then 4,773 years ago, 4,750 years ago, the end of the early Dynastic period and the beginning of the early Dynastic II period in Mesopotamia. So, anyways, I can go on and read some more stuff, but I think I'm going to stop right there at reading as many as I was going to. You get the idea. There's an evolution. So let's go to the next thing. So let's go back to what I was talking about to begin with. So we have pre-Animism, again, to recap. Pre-Animism basically at 300,000 years ago Then we have Animism at around 100,000 years ago. Totemism at around 50,000 years ago. Then we have Shamanism at around 30,000 years ago. Paganism at around 12,000 years ago. Progressed organized religion is around 5,000 years ago. So that is basically the understanding religion evolution: animism, totemism, shamanism, paganism, and progressed organized religion. So now let me address the current timelines of religion, which is after 4,000 years ago. So Hinduism is around 3,000, in a sense, 700 years ago to 3,500 years old. Judaism, harder to tell exactly, but I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. It's from 3,450 to 3,250 years old, although it could be orally. Although the first, in a sense, Hebrew writing, or Paleo-Hebrew, is only dated to about 3,000 years ago. So it certainly wasn't written before that. Jainism is about 2,599 years ago to 2,527 years old. Confucianism is around 2,600 to 2,551 years old. Buddhism is around 2,563 to 2,480 or 2,400 years old, depending on who you talk to. Christianity is around 2,000 years old. Shinto is around 1,305 years old. Islam is around 1,407 to 1,385 years old. Sikhism is around 548 to 478 years old. Bali faith is around 200 to 125 years old. And there we have the timeline of religion. And religion is an evolved product. And I appreciate you for listening, and I'm hoping that you learned something and enjoyed yourself. All right. Bye.